Hi everyone. So welcome to the next section of the course, which will be remote learning. And we have a little bit to finish up before exam number 2, the chapters on numbers and counting, numerical cognition in animals. So we'll start with that. That's part of the physical cognition broader category that we've been working on. So, in the beginning, studies of animal counting were not very scientific, and there's been this long history of sort of hoaxes in the animal counting world. There was this famous horse named Clever Hans, and he was supposed to be able to count out numbers and little arithmetic problems using his hooves to clump out the correct answer for these simple problems. His owner took Hans all around the world in circus acts and different sideshow acts and showed people Hans's wonderful ability at understanding numbers and getting arithmetic problems correct. Now, this was not a scientific study. This was just basically, an observational thing. And certain scientists took notice of this and said, wait a minute, I don't know if really what Hans is doing is really math abilities or if something else is going on. So Oscar von Funks was the first one to actually apply some controls and look at Hans's abilities. Once von Funks put some controls in place, like having the experimenter hidden, or the person who knew the answers hidden from Hans, then Hans did not know the correct answer. He only knew it when his owner was present and giving him the questions, and when his owner knew the correct answers. So what was found was that the owner was subconsciously cueing the horse. When he got close to the right answer, he would sort of nod his head, and Hans was really good at picking up on these social cues. And so basically it became a laughingstock. People have now scrutinized this study. The Clever Hans effect is sort of a fake result showing animal cognition based on social cueing rather than actually understanding the problem. So for a while, the whole field of numerical cognition was, looked upon with skepticism and sort of shunned. No one wanted to study it until they came up with better experimental designs, including things like sitting behind the animal so not to cue the animal, or even being in a different room or having a blind in place. So those basically improved experimental designs and helped in the study of animal cognition and numerical cognition later on. So numerical competence shouldn't be really looked at as one thing. It's a set of several skills that can build on one another, and animals can have some subset of these skills or many of these skills. But we have to look at these things sort of individually. We need to tear apart number competence, number cognition by skills, and look at which animals possess which skills, and then think about evolutionarily why have they developed these skills based on what their environmental challenges were. So if you look at just a small amount of numbers, like one apple or two apples on a plate, you don't need to count those. So you can just rapidly look at those and just know that there are two items there. You don't have to count one and then two. Up to about 4 items, we can rapidly assess and understand a quantity without actually counting. And we call this skill subitizing. It's kind of a weird word, subitizing, for very small quantities, just looking at and knowing how many there are without counting. Now for humans, we have what we call numerals, like Roman numerals or Arabic numerals. In the animal world, they tend to be called numerons or numerical tags. A tag is a symbol in the case of like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or the verbal word 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These are all tags that symbolize or represent a quantity. So we'll be talking about those things. If we have a set of objects, let's say we have 5 apples, Then the last number, 5, or the last tag, the last numeral, is special because it tells us how many numbers are in the set, and we call that number the cardinal number. If we're talking about putting things in a series or order of increasing magnitude or increasing value from, smallest to largest or something like that, first, second, third, then we're talking about the property of ordinality, and we would call those numbers first, second, third ordinal numbers. So ordinal has to do with putting things in a series of increasing value. Now, when we have numerical tags, then we can think about the word counting, because we can then say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then the epitome, I guess, the best, the truest, the highest cognitive ability is what we call true counting. And this is where we have a representation of a quantity, and we can transfer the numerons or the numerical tags to any object. So we could have 6 apples, or we could have 6 sounds, or 6 predators, or 6 offspring. And that's the idea of truly knowing what the value of something is. So one of the people who was kind of studying numerical cognition all along historically was Kohler, and he was doing some rigorous studies. His study subjects were birds, so they were corvids, crows and jays, and jackdaws, and he was collecting lots and lots of data and videotaping these while the field of animal cognition was kind of stagnating. He carried on with this work about matching quantities. So the way he would do this is basically like what we learned before, a matching to sample test. It's a matching to sample. There's no delay, so it's not delayed matching to sample, but this crow would see a card. This is the sample, and on this card are 4 objects. So the idea was this crow had to pick which one of these samples has the corresponding number of objects. So he would have to pick the one with 4. He can knock this card off, and there'll be some food underneath, and he can then get a reinforcement for doing this. Now notice one important thing that Kohler was looking at. It wasn't matching the picture or the arrangement, it was matching the quantity. So Kohler smartly arranged these dots in different sizes and in different arrays or configurations on the board to make sure that the crows were actually identifying by number, by quantity. And that was a really good. So he did a lot of experimental controls with this. And he found that crows actually are very good at understanding numerical quantities. So quantity discrimination is basically the first step of understanding numerical competence. Animals need to be able to discriminate quantities of things for obvious reasons. If you see 2 trees, if you're an animal and you see 2 trees, one of them has 10 pieces of fruit and the other one has 6 pieces of fruit, which tree should you climb and get the fruit? And of course you're going to utilize energy. You'd want to go for the one with more. Or the number of predators, you'd want to be able to keep track of where there are more predators or where there are more competitors, or things like how many offspring you have. You'd want to be able to keep track of that. Animals that are good at keeping track would be the ones that would survive better and pass on their genes better. So the propensity to be good at discriminating quantities is adaptive, evolutionarily adaptive, and has been passed on. So this basic function of quantity discrimination, just telling apart amounts of things, numbers of things, is something that we find in every phylogenetic group. So all species of animals that we've examined, even very simple animals, can to some extent tell apart different quantities. This has been passed along. And there are lots of studies to show this idea. So cowbirds, which we learned last time in a video, that they're brood parasites. They lay their eggs in another bird's nest, a little songbird's nest, and then they go away and force the little songbird to raise their young as their own. But the cowbirds can tell the difference between a host nest with 3 eggs or 1 egg. And of course, they're going to prefer to lay their parasitic egg in a nest with more eggs, with the idea that the host bird will not be able to distinguish and therefore will not reject their egg. So cowbirds can understand number. Crows can identify one another by the number of caws. So when you hear a crow going caw, 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 that's sort of like a signature sound that he makes, and they respond differently to individuals depending on the number of caws that are present. Another bird example are chickadees, the birds that go chickadee-dee-dee. You've probably heard those. They're common around with the little black caps on them. They found experimentally that the more threatening, the more dangerous a predator is, the more D's will be in that call. So chickadee-dee-dee-dee-dee is more of a threat than chickadee-dee-dee. For amphibians, we have frogs that actually identify each other and do recognition for mating purposes by the number of pulses in their croak. So they actually respond differently depending on the number, the pieces of frog song that are present in the croaks. Up to even 10 croaks long, they can identify and behave differently towards these. So they're also assessing other qualities of the croak, like how long the croaks are and the volume of the croak. And females use these as identifying factors to figure out which male would make a good mate for offspring quality, because the ability to produce these long songs takes a certain amount of energy. Let's see if I have frog song. So there you have the females evaluating these males based on the quality and the duration and the number of croaks they make. You can also run an experiment by on insects. So even insects and honeybees can understand the number of objects. You can use a landmark study and place a certain number of landmarks on the way between the food and their hive. And then if you alter that, they actually make errors based on the number of landmarks. So you can sort of trick them and tell that they're using the quantity or the number of landmarks as directions, as markers, and keeping track of those quantities. Lions, in this case, can gauge their behavior and listen to the number of lions in a distant group. So they'll hear a group of lions, will hear another group of lions far away, and decide whether or not they should approach based on the number of individuals in their own group and the number of individuals in the other group. And if, say, this lion here, this female, is in a large group of lions herself, she would then tend to be bolder and approach if she heard, engaged by the number of other lions that she heard. So if you're in a large group of lions and you hear a small group of lions in the distance, you'll be bolder and approach. And they gauge their behavior based on the number of competitors that they hear. Hyenas, another large social mammal, can also be given auditory playback experiments. And they actually found out that they are counting the number of whoops in a call. So they can identify individuals making these different calls by the number of whoops, kind of like what the crows do. And these animals are thought to be very intelligent animals. They live in very complex primate-like groups with dominance hierarchies. They happen to have a very large brain for their size and probably have very good numerical cognition. I'm going to skip this, so just put, let's see if I can do, omit, oops, I don't know if I can. There we go, omit that. So we're not going to cover that. And let's see, omitting all of that on chicks. Okay. Oops, now how do I get rid of this? Not sure how I get rid of that now. There. Okay. I should go back to this though. Dogs tend to rely on humans so they can understand these cognitive differences in quantity, but if you tell they could tell the difference between one piece of food and no food at all, but they had trouble with larger quantities. And wolves actually were better at discriminating different quantities of food. So it suggests that the dogs sort of rely on people, and wolves actually are pretty good at number cognition. So this is a difference in domestication. Domestication can have an effect on different types of cognitive abilities. Okay. So, quantity discrimination. Now, what are the rules that govern how we discriminate different quantities? Now, this, if you were hungry, let's say, this amount of jelly beans obviously is more than this one. This is a very easy discrimination to make. So, the way we do this is we design an experiment where we give an animal a two-way choice task. So they would have to choose between two sides. Let's say the animal is sitting here. There are two trays. The animal can make a choice, and then they get the one that they chose. The other one goes away. We call this a two-way choice task. Now, this is an easy discrimination, but what would have happened if I would have had like 56 jelly beans over here and 55 jelly beans over here? That becomes a more difficult kind of discrimination to make. So the law that describes these kinds of choices is called Weber's law. And Weber's law says it's easy to discriminate between two quantities when the ratio between the number of items is small rather than large. So we need to think about these ratios. And if we have, let's say, 2 objects on one side and 8 objects on the other side, we make a ratio out of this. 2 to 8 ratio is the same as saying 1 to 4, so it's a 0.25 ratio. That's an easy one, but what if they get closer together? The 7 jelly beans on one side and 8 jelly beans on the other side becomes a 0.88 ratio. And you notice as we approach 1 would be, the ratio would be if there was 8 jelly beans on one side and 8 on the other. So when the two sides are the same, the choice between the two is the same, you can't make a difference. It's impossible. So that's really difficult. So this is the principle behind the laws. It's a ratio. And this ratio tends to hold true in a wide range of species that we've tested. So one way that you would test this then is with what's called an expectancy paradigm. You have 2 buckets, you have a bucket, you put some grapes in there, there's a false bottom, and without having the animal, in this case a lemur, know it, you remove some of those grapes. And then you record the searching time. How long do they search? If they're expecting more, the idea here is that they notice the difference between how many went in and how many they found. They would have a longer search time. And they did that only when half were missing. So in other words, I put in 4 grapes and I take out 2 of them. So they find 2 grapes and they keep looking for a long time. They're like, where are those other 2 grapes? And this is ratio dependent. So if you put in 2 and they find 1, they notice. If you put in 4 and they find 2, they notice. But look what happens here. If you put in 3 grapes and they find 2 grapes, they stop looking. It's as if they don't notice the difference between these two. Or if you put in 4 and they find only 3, they stop looking. They're not expecting anymore. The search time is shorter. So what we find is 2 parts of this Weber's law. The distance effect is explaining that the farther apart the numbers are, the quicker animals can make a response, which one is the greater. So if you were comparing 5 jelly beans versus 8 jelly beans, or 7 versus 8, the farther apart discrimination would be an easier one to do. Now the other thing is, the magnitude effect just explains that smaller numbers are easier to discriminate. So like if we had a 5 versus 6, that would be an easier discrimination than 8 versus 9. And you can see that, and if I gave you that problem again, 56 versus 55, that's a difficult discrimination, but 1 versus 2 would be very easy. So we have two parts of Weber's law, the distance effect and the magnitude effect. And Hauser in 2000, who was a primatologist, looked at the application of Weber's law for monkeys, and he found that there was an issue. So let me come back to this for a second, but let me show you how the experiment looks. You have a monkey here. He has a choice between two boxes. You place some apple slices while this monkey is looking into the two boxes. Now look at these results here. If you place 1 apple and 0 apples, almost every single time they select 1 apple versus 0. If you put in 2 slices versus 1, most of them choose 2 over 1. 3 versus 2, they can do it. 4 versus 3. But look what happens here. If you put 5 apples in this box, 4 apples in this box, they can't tell the difference. They start having trouble with this. And what's really fascinating to me is once you get to here, 8 apples versus 4 apples, 8 versus 4, they have trouble with this. They don't seem to make a discriminative behavioral difference with 8 versus 4. So something's happening, once we get above around 4, that's interesting to note. So coming back to this slide, the monkeys chose, the box with the larger, but only when neither set was greater than 4. So something happens with this idea of 4. You can also do the same kind of study with sounds, so numbers of sounds like beep, 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 beep. And you can do what's called a dishabituation study where if something is new, you would pay attention to it, orienting yourself to the speaker. If something was the same, it's basically a match to sample again, or delayed match to sample with sounds. But you can play different numbers of sounds and see if they notice. So the sample might have 3, and then you would play 2 and see if they look, seeing that's different. And again, the result of this kind of study with these sounds was that the ratios mattered. So once we got to these sort of ratios, 4 to 5 ratio, they sort of fell apart. They don't notice the difference between the numbers of sounds there. So they needed an explanation, a mechanism of how to explain what was going on with this type of numerical cognition and why the problem was 4. And the problem, the explanation that people have put forth is that animals and people can represent numbers, small numbers, discretely. So when you're subitizing, the idea is that your brain has a little, it's not really a file, but it's a group of cells that are interested in or firing action potentials for that, just that quantity. So in other words, if you see 2 things, something in your brain is activated by 2. Up to 4, we can handle those kinds of object activations or discrete numerosity activations. And this might explain why 4 becomes sort of a stumbling block for a lot of animals. And all of these animals, these are sea lions and salamanders, all different kinds of animals, seem to have this problem discriminating discrete quantities of 4. Now that doesn't mean that they can't estimate larger quantities. We know that they have to be able to have a mechanism for estimating larger quantities. And this separate kind of system was proposed called the approximate number system or analog magnitude system that can explain how animals can non-discretely or do an estimate of different quantities of objects. So now the objects are not represented, discretely as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but they're represented as, this is a large quantity and this is a smaller quantity, kind of a fuzzier type of representation. And so we have lots of studies here that show that you don't have to necessarily recognize absolute numbers to understand the difference between two sets of objects. So these studies here, dolphins, sea lions, other animals, could absolutely estimate different quantities accurately beyond the number of 4, just not discrete representations. So they can discriminate roughly larger quantities for it, but not discretely. We have presentation number 10, which will be posted in the modules, and this was a really novel sort of experimental design looking at quantity discrimination in fish. So I'll let you take a look at that and see how they measured whether fish can also do quantity discrimination. Okay, the other thing you can do is look at a simple arithmetic, putting some objects behind a screen and then adding more objects and seeing if animals and babies can keep track of that. I shouldn't really have said impossible situations, but they look at something that they weren't expecting longer, like they look, hey, that's weird. I thought there was supposed to be more in there, and I'm not seeing what I expected. So it's another expectancy kind of a experiment. So here's how this thing looks. You put a toy in, let's say a child is watching, put a toy in, there's a trap door, the toy goes below, then you add another one. So this is the same as like a 1 + 1 addition problem. You add one in, take your hand out, and then you look and see how long the babies stare at these two different scenarios. This is what they were expecting, so we don't see a long looking time, but if you show them just one coming out of this hidden trapdoor area, then they stare at that longer. So we're measuring looking time here, and they're actually keeping track of small quantities, and the monkeys can do the same exact thing. So here we have addition also in chimpanzees with amounts of chocolate and summing the amounts of chocolates in 2 bowls. And chimps can do this. They can keep track of how much chocolate, how many pieces of chocolate are in the bowls 90% of the time. So that's pretty good. They're watching. Again, it was an expectancy and a sort of simple addition kind of a problem. Now, the next number skill is ordination, or ordering things, putting things in the order of increasing magnitude, such as different kinds of elements or things that go in a sequence, but also the rank order, the dominance position, I guess you can say, of individuals in a social hierarchy. It's the same thing as saying, like, if there's a group of people, the most dominant would be number 1, and then the subordinate would be below them. That kind of thing has to do with placing things in order. So we want to know if animals also have abilities to think about things in order of increasing magnitude. So we already talked about these cardinality. The final number in a set is the cardinal number. Ordinal number has to do with numbers that are going in an ordinal sequence. So like 1, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, those are ordinal numbers. Putting things in order is the property of ordinality. Now there's a skill called transitive inference that says that the ability to choose between a pair of objects can be related transitively. In other words, you can make an inference about objects based on some information that you have about the value of those things. So if I told you that A is greater than B, has more value, and B has more value than C, without telling you anything about the relationship of A to C, I didn't tell you anything about A versus C, you could infer that A is larger or greater than C. So this is a type of reasoning that you have to make a jump. You have to make a leap without and fill in the information without being told specifically. So we want to know if animals can also have this transitive inference ability. So we'll talk about some of these different kinds of tasks that are done. We've already seen something like this. I think I showed you a video of I, the chimp, touching numerical quantities of objects on a touch screen in order of increasing magnitude. So touch 1, 2, 3, and then 4. If you do that, you get a reward. Now you can also change this up so that you can vary the shape of the objects, the arrangement of the objects on the cards, and still see if the animal is going by number. So this monkey here should touch 1, 2, 3, and then 4, and they can do that. But when they do that, they also made errors that were related to Weber's law. So as the ratio between numbers became closer to 1, they made errors and slowed down just the same way as people do. So these are the monkey's results. These are the human results. In a nice comparative study, humans just did better in general than the monkeys did, but the exact same pattern of responses where ratio mattered, and also as the ratio approached 1, the percentage correct, the errors increased in both monkeys and humans alike. So it's really cool that we have the exact same pattern of responding in these kinds of tasks, and the exact same types of errors are made. Okay, so we can have an arbitrary sequence. I told you that numerons, numerical tags, are made up things, and we could call this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the best reward being this symbol. So we can train a pigeon on these symbolic things, meaning that if this flag is present, you get a very, very good reward. This is a pretty good reward too, but as we go down this order here, this symbol is not a very good reward at all. And then we can test the pigeon for understanding of transitivity, transitive inference, and we can see that they also exhibit the magnitude and distance effects. So if we tested a pigeon now with these two symbols, which are the best one and a not so good one, the pigeon chooses the best one. That's no problem. If we give them this lightning bolt and this plus sign thing here, the lightning bolt is actually the worst one, and the pigeons know that, and they can, after they've been trained, obviously, with these values, they can pick this one over this one every time. Now what we see, though, is the ones in the middle, for these three species were tested: humans, a capuchin monkey, and a rhesus macaque. We see the same exact kinds of distance effect and magnitude effects with Weber's law. So this discrimination between this one and this one is easy. They get it correct most of the time. Reaction times are very quick. The ones in the middle are more difficult. So that's our distance effect. Farther apart are easier. And then also the increasing magnitude ones become more difficult. So we see the exact same kinds of effects with all three species with regards to these arbitrary symbols, but increasing values. And we can also do transitive inference tests with these kinds of symbols. Okay, so we're going to omit this. And the next couple of slides we're going to also omit. If I can figure out how to do that. So we're omitting, sorry. So let's omit this one, and we'll omit this one as well. But I do want to talk about nonverbal or social transitive inference. This is inferring the dominance rank, the hierarchy, or the, number 1, number 2 in a group. So if you were out and you saw a fist fight, let's say at a bar, Jim beats up Mark, you take that, put that into your memory system. And then let's say 2 weeks later, you see another fist fight. This time Mark is fighting with this guy Tom, but Mark wins this time. Now, you can make what we call social transitive inference, a nonverbal transitive inference. By never having seen these two fight one another, you could probably guess that Jim would dominate over Tom. You don't need to see these guys to fight. If you're placing money or a bet or something, you would bet on Jim most likely, and you also wouldn't tangle with Jim because you know that he's dominant to, at least one other individual that you saw. So animals are really good at doing these kinds of dominance hierarchy tasks without having to actually get into fights. The idea is to not get injured. So the way that this experiment is set up is that there's a focal bird. There is a hierarchy of birds that he belongs to. They're numbered 1, 2, 3. So he's the third ranking bird in his group. There's another group of birds that have names A through, A, B, C, D, E. And the highest ranking bird in this group is A. The highest ranking bird in his group is 1. This bird is watching experimental, basically agonistic fights over food. You put 2 hungry birds in a cage, there's some food there, and you watch who does this bowing out behavior. This bowing is a sign of submission. This guy will bow and allow the dominant bird to have the food. And then you see the loser of this bird will watch the loser of this fight. Remember, he doesn't know the identity of any of these birds, but he does know this guy. So he knows this guy from his group is superior to him. He sees this bird bow out to B. And then what you do is you put the focal bird into a cage with B, who he's never fought with, never been in close proximity to, and he immediately bows out because he takes this into consideration. Number 2, his superior lost, and so he will infer that he should immediately bow to this one. So birds, these are scrub jays. These are really good at these kinds of things. Now the other thing is we would assume, based on the social intelligence hypothesis, that more social species should be better at these kinds of social transitive inference tasks. They should be better at understanding dominance hierarchies. And this is exactly what we see. They tested 2 closely related species of lemurs. One of them, the ring-tailed lemur, is a social species, and the other one is a less social, more solitary species. And it turns out that this is actually true. The more social ring-tailed lemurs actually are better at social inference task, at understanding where individuals fall in a dominance hierarchy, better than the less social mongoose lemur, which supports the social intelligence hypothesis. And that's it for now. I'll resume on the next lecture.